The lab wasn't really a lab. It was a converted warehouse near Ponce, walls sweating in the heat, generators outside chewing through diesel because the grid was still mostly a rumor. This was 6 weeks after Maria. Bodies were coming in faster than we could log them, and the refrigerated trailers out back were full. I flew in from the Netherlands with the second wave. Our team was mixed. A guy named Piet from Utrecht, 2 Argentinians from EAAF, a Colombian dentist called Marcella, a British odontologist we all just called Rob because his last name was unpronounceable when you'd slept 4 hours. Locals rotated in and out. Most of them had lost someone or something themselves, and it showed in small ways. Marcella would forget words she'd known in English for 20 years and just stop mid-sentence, staring at the tray. The smell you don't get used to, no matter what people tell you. It's not one smell. Diesel, bleach, mold from the walls. And under all of that, the thing you're actually there for. By the 3rd week, you stop noticing it in the lab and start noticing it in your hair when you get back to the hotel. There were 7 of us on rotation at any given time. 2 anthropologists, an odontologist, a DNA tech, a couple of local police liaisons, and whichever pathologist was on that day. We slept at a hotel in Ponce that had one wall of every room still tarped over from the storm. The elevator worked in the mornings and gave up around lunchtime. You learned which pharmacies had reopened and which ones only pretended to. You learned that a light being on in a coastal town didn't mean the fridge was cold. We worked in batches, skeletal or near-skeletal remains, mostly. People who'd been in collapsed houses or mudslides in the interior and only came out when family finally reached in and pulled. Some had been in the water. A lot of them had been alone. That's the part nobody wants to talk about publicly, that a hurricane doesn't just kill people at the moment it passes. It kills the diabetic grandmother who couldn't get insulin 4 days later. It kills the guy on dialysis. Those are the ones we were processing in November. I got assigned a set of remains logged as PR-4471. Female, adult, initial estimate late 30s to mid 40s based on the pelvis and the cranial sutures. She'd been recovered from a small house outside Utuado, according to the intake sheet. No wallet, no ID, no jewelry. Neighbors said an older woman had lived there, but they weren't sure of her name. Nobody had filed a missing persons report. I did the workup the way you always do it, measured everything, noted an old healed fracture on the left clavicle, dental work that looked North American rather than Puerto Rican. I stood there for a while, looking at the clavicle, honestly. It reminded me of my own. I'd broken mine falling off a bike when I was 11, and the healed ridge on this one sat in almost the same place. That happens. Clavicles break where clavicles break. I moved on. Sampling was standard. Femur, molar. I did the femur myself, drilled the sample, sealed it, labeled it, walked it over to Piet's station because he was running the extraction that night. He nodded, didn't look up. That was the whole interaction. Results usually took 2 to 3 days depending on the queue. This one came back the next afternoon, which was fast enough that I looked at the timestamp twice. Marcella pushed the printout across the bench to me and said something like, "You've got a hit already, Lucky." She was smiling. She'd had none of hers hit yet. The database we were cross-referencing was a mix. Local dental and DNA records where they existed, the FBI's CODIS for anyone registered stateside, and a couple of private ancestry uploads families had authorized. A match this quick usually meant the person had been in a system before. I took the printout back to my station, sat down, read the profile. It was mine. I want to be careful here. I don't mean it looked like mine or it was close to mine. It was mine. Every marker, every locus. 3 years earlier, I'd registered with an international DVI program. We all had to. They took a buccal swab and stored it as a reference in case one of us ever ended up in a mass grave in the wrong country. The profile in front of me was the same profile. Same reference number stem, same lab of origin, 100%. You have to understand what that means in this work. In actual casework, you don't say 100%. You say match probabilities, likelihood ratios, numbers with a lot of decimal places that tell a judge how confident you are. 100% is what the software prints when the profiles are literally the same file. Not related, not similar, the same. I sat there for probably a full minute. The generator outside kicked into a higher gear and the lights flickered, which they did about twice an hour. I remember watching my hands on the paper and thinking they looked like somebody else's hands. That's the only theatrical thing I'll say. Everything else was quiet. The obvious explanation was contamination. I knew that. Buccal swabs shed, skin cells shed. I'd worked over that femur without a fresh mask because we were rationing them. Piet ran the extraction, and Piet and I had shared a coffee thermos that morning, though he wasn't the match, I was. The reference database had my swab in it because I'd put it there. If any part of my own DNA had ended up on that bone, in that drill, in that tube, the software would find the cleanest profile in the sample and spit it out. That was almost certainly what had happened. Almost certainly. I got up, walked to the sink. Washed my hands twice. Came back, read the profile again. It was still mine. Here's what I did next, and I've thought about it a lot. I voided the result in the system, flagged PR-4471 as sample compromised, suspected exogenous DNA, resample required. That's a legitimate call. It happens. Nobody questions it because nobody wants a false ID going to a family. I gowned up properly this time, new mask, new gloves, a fresh field around the remains. Drilled a second sample from the other femur, handed it to one of the Argentinians for extraction, not Piet, because I told myself I wanted a different pair of hands on it, and that was even true. 2 days later, that sample came back with a different profile, female. No match in any database we had access to. PR-4471 stayed a Jane Doe. I signed off on the case. Wrote up the anthropological report, skeletal indicators, healed clavicle, dental work, estimated age 41 to 46, sent it upstairs. She got processed and eventually released for burial, as unidentified when the deadline ran out. As far as I know, she is still unidentified. Her family, if she had one, never came. I did not tell anyone about the first result. Not Piet, not Marcella, not my supervisor when I flew back to The Hague in December. There is a procedure for reporting suspected contamination events, and I did not follow it, because following it would have meant naming what the contamination was. The report would have gone into a file. Someone would have asked later, in some other context, why my personal reference had shown up on a body in Puerto Rico. I did not want to answer that question, then or later. What I did do, and this is the part I keep coming back to, is I saved the original result, copied the PDF to my personal laptop before I voided it. I told myself at the time that I was keeping it for my own records in case there was ever an inquiry. That was a reasonable thing to say. I even believed it for a few weeks. I still have the file. It's in a folder on my work laptop, 3 levels deep, named something boring. I don't hide it exactly. I just don't look at it in front of anyone. Sometimes, though, I open it, not on any schedule. Sometimes months go by. Then I'll be on a plane or in a hotel room in some other country waiting for another job to start, and I'll open the laptop and click through to that folder and open the PDF. It's 2 pages. The first page is the case metadata for PR-4471. The second is the profile comparison. There's a line near the top of the second page that gives the match probability. It says 100%. I look at it for a while. I don't do anything with it. I don't call anyone. I just look at the number. Then I close the file and close the laptop and go do whatever I was going to do. I've talked myself through it more times than I can count. Contamination is the answer. It has to be. I know the science. I know how easy it is for a hair to fall, a glove to brush a bone, a bench to be wiped down with the wrong cloth. The second sample gave a different profile, and that profile is the real profile of the woman who was in that house outside Utuado. The first result was noise. That is what the evidence says. But every so often I think about the clavicle. Same side, same place. And I think about the intake sheet, which said the neighbors weren't sure of her name. And I think about how nobody ever came for her. I don't have a story about that. There isn't one. I'm alive, I'm sitting here, I know where I was in November 2017, and I know I was not in a house outside Utuado. There is no version of this where the numbers on that page mean what they look like they mean. I know that. I still open the file. The first thing I noticed about Ellis was that he was always 5 minutes early. Never 4, never 6. Every other Thursday at 2:55, he'd be sitting in the plastic chair by the water cooler, hands folded, looking at the wall like he was working something out in his head. I've been doing probation in Phoenix for 11 years. The office is on 24th Street, 2nd floor, above a check cashing place and a nail salon that always smells like acetone, even through the vents. May of 2022 was brutal. We hit 105 by the first week, and the AC groaned every time somebody opened the front door. Ellis was assigned to me in November. Nonviolent, 7 years served on a stretch I don't need to get into here. He was in his late 40s, wiry, dark hair going gray at the temples, and he had the kind of quiet you get from people who've spent a long time learning not to take up space. He answered questions with exactly as many words as the question required. Not rude, just clean. He held down a job at a landscaping company out in Ahwatukee. Boss loved him. Showed up at 5 a.m. every day, never late, never sick. Rented a room off baseline from a widow who cooked him dinner sometimes. Drug tests clean. Curfew logs clean. In 11 years, I've had maybe 4 guys that squeaky. Usually the squeaky ones are hiding something. I kept waiting for the something. Around the 3rd month, I noticed the gifts. Not to me. That's the part I want to be clear about. He never brought me anything. First time I caught it was February. He was leaving my office, and Rosa, our cleaning lady, was pushing her cart down the hall. Ellis stopped, reached into his jacket, handed her a little tube of something and said, "For your hands," then walked out. I asked Rosa later what he gave her. It was some kind of udder cream, the stuff dairy farmers use on cows. She showed me. She said her knuckles had been cracking open all winter from the bleach, and she'd mentioned it once to Denise at the front desk, maybe 2 weeks earlier. Rosa didn't remember Ellis being there when she said it. She was almost certain he wasn't. I filed it under coincidence. Nice guy notices someone's hands are chapped, thinks of them next time he's at the store. People do that. 2 weeks later, he brought a paperback for Marcus, the security guard who sits at the front, some Louis L'Amour Western. Marcus's dad had died in January, and he'd told me, not Ellis, that his dad used to read those to him when he was a kid. Marcus took the book and just sat there holding it for a while. Didn't say anything for the rest of the shift. Third one was insoles. Gel insoles, the kind that cost $30. He left them in a paper bag on Denise's desk with a post-it that said, "For the back." Denise had been complaining about her lower back for months. She'd stopped complaining, actually, because she got tired of hearing her own voice. But Ellis left them anyway. That's when I started paying attention. I asked him about it on our next visit. Casual. I said, "That was nice, what you did for Denise." He looked at me like he was trying to figure out what answer I was fishing for. Then he shrugged and said, "Her chair's too low. She keeps rubbing the base of her spine when she gets up." I hadn't noticed that. I sit across from Denise 5 days a week, and I hadn't noticed. Over the next couple months, I started keeping a little mental list. Not writing it down, just holding it in my head. A can of specific pipe tobacco for the maintenance guy who only came by once a month. A pack of unscented baby wipes for the receptionist who just had her second kid and hadn't told anyone at work she was breastfeeding again. A cheap novelty keychain shaped like a Ford Bronco for Marcus. 3 days before Marcus mentioned to me he'd finally decided to sell his dad's old truck. 3 days before. I remember standing in the parking lot after that appointment. The asphalt was soft under my boots, and the heat coming off the cars was pushing back at me like a hand on my chest. I stood there long enough that my shirt stuck to my back, and I still didn't know what I was standing there for. Every gift was small, under $20, most of them. Every gift was for a different person, and every gift was, honestly, exactly the right thing. Not close. Right. I want to say I was scared, but that's not the word. It was more like watching somebody do a card trick where you can't figure out the mechanism, and the longer you watch, the less you want to know. I pulled his file again, read the whole thing top to bottom. Nothing. Model prisoner. GED inside. Some coursework in HVAC he never finished. 2 commendations from a chaplain. No incidents. No known affiliations. His original conviction was for something stupid he did when he was younger and drunker, and I won't get into it. But it wasn't anything that fit what I was watching. I talked to my supervisor, not officially, just at lunch, over a burrito, at the place on the corner, green chile and extra sour cream. I told her about the gifts. She said, "So he's a nice guy. What's the problem?" I said I didn't know what the problem was. She said, "Then there isn't one." She was right. There wasn't one. He wasn't breaking any condition of his release. He wasn't giving anything to me, which would have been an actual issue. He was being kind to people at a government office who mostly don't get much kindness from anybody. I let it go. Or I tried to. The thing that stuck with me, the thing I couldn't get past, was the timing. The insoles came before Denise ever mentioned her back to him. The keychain came before Marcus decided to sell the truck. He wasn't reacting. He was ahead of it. And once you notice that, you can't unnotice it. I started watching him watch people. In the waiting room, in the hallway, on the sidewalk outside when I'd catch a glimpse of him leaving. He didn't stare. That was the thing. He looked at people the way you look at a road while you're driving. Constant, low, taking in everything, not fixed on any one point. He watched their hands, what they carried, what they set down, and what they picked up first, whether they favored one leg, whether they checked their phone or their watch, and how often. I'd been doing this 11 years. I'd never watched people like that in my life. His last appointment was the second Thursday in May. Sentence complete, conditions met, paperwork signed. I told him he was done. He nodded, same nod he'd given me every visit for 6 months. He stood up to leave and I asked him. I'd promised myself I wouldn't, and then I did. I said, "Ellis, how do you always know what people need?" He stopped with his hand on the door. He turned around and looked at me, and for the first time in half a year, he actually looked at me the way he looked at everybody else. It took maybe 2 seconds. It felt longer. Then he smiled. Small smile, not much teeth. He said, "I spent a lot of years watching people. Inside, that's how you stay alive. Out here, it's how you live." That was it. He walked out. I heard him say something to Marcus on the way past the front desk, and Marcus laughed, and then the buzzer went and he was gone. I sat there for a while. It's a good answer. That's the thing. It's a real answer. Anybody who's done time will tell you the same, more or less. You learn to read a room because reading the room is the difference between eating your dinner and not eating your dinner. He wasn't wrong. He wasn't hiding anything. I signed off on his file that afternoon and went home and had a beer and watched the Diamondbacks lose, and mostly I forgot about it by the end of the week. Mostly. Here's the part I keep coming back to. The morning of that last appointment, before he showed up, I spilled coffee on my shirt. Nothing dramatic. I was reaching for a folder, knocked the mug, got a brown stripe down the front of a white button-down. I went to the bathroom, blotted it, gave up, wore my jacket the rest of the day, buttoned. Nobody in the office saw the stain. Nobody knew about it. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. I checked later with Denise and Marcus both. I asked in a roundabout way. Nobody had seen. When Ellis stood up to leave my office that afternoon, before I asked him the question, before he gave me his answer, he set something down on the corner of my desk. First and only thing he ever left for me. He didn't say anything about it. He just put it down and walked out. It was one of those Tide pens, the little stain remover sticks, still in the plastic. I threw it in the drawer. It's still in there. I check on him once in a while. Not officially. I don't have any reason to. He's still at the landscaping company, still renting the room off Baseline. The widow told me, when I called with a made-up question about a form, that he brought her a heating pad in July for a shoulder she hadn't complained to him about. I don't think he's dangerous. I want to be clear about that. In 11 years of this job, I've sat across from people who were dangerous, and he isn't one of them. I just don't like how quiet a room gets when he leaves it. Like everyone in it is trying to remember what they said out loud and what they only thought. This was October 2019, in a town in central Idaho I'm not going to name. There are maybe 2,000 people who live there, and half of them would figure out who I mean by the third paragraph. I do field work on closed religious communities. That's the polite phrase for it. Some of them are fine, some of them are complicated, and every so often you land on one that makes your stomach turn slowly, for reasons you can't articulate for weeks. This was one of those. The organization ran out of a 2-story building off the main road, with a hand-painted sign that just said Fellowship House and the hours underneath. Food bank on Tuesdays, youth group Wednesdays, community dinner every Sunday. From the outside, it was the most boring thing in the county. That was part of why I wanted to spend time there. The boring ones are the ones nobody writes about, and the ones nobody writes about are where the interesting patterns live. I rented a room above a coffee shop, the kind with a bell on the door and a laminated menu that hadn't changed since the Bush administration. The lady who owned it, Doreen, told me on the first day that she used to fellowship with them but didn't anymore. She said it in a flat voice, like she was telling me she used to smoke. When I tried to follow up, she asked if I wanted my coffee refilled and walked off. That should have been my first note. It wasn't. I put it under a general heading about lapsed members and moved on. The steward, that was the title, a man in his 60s named Elias, invited me to Sunday dinner my second night. He wore a flannel shirt and had a handshake that felt like an apology for how strong it was. He was warm, genuinely warm. He asked about my dissertation, laughed at the right places, remembered the name of my department without me repeating it. His wife Marla brought out a casserole that was mostly potato and the kind of kindness that makes you feel guilty for being a stranger. There were about 40 people in the dining hall. Nobody looked afraid. Nobody looked drugged or weird. That's important to say because the mind wants those signs. I did 14 interviews in the first week. Everyone signed a consent form. Everyone offered me coffee. A man named Tom, who ran the food bank, showed me their intake spreadsheets without me asking. A woman my age, Cass, told me about growing up in the fellowship and how she went to state school for 2 years before coming back. She said it was her choice. She said it twice. I didn't push. On day 8, I noticed the thing. I was reviewing my transcripts at the coffee shop, cross-referencing who had mentioned whom, the way you do to build out a social map, and I kept hitting these little dead spots. Someone would list off the families they grew up with, and there would be a name that came up in one interview, and then never again. I'd ask a follow-up. Oh, the Henriksons, right? They were around when I was a kid. Pause. You want more coffee? Not deaths. I want to make that clear. I checked. The names I was tracking were people who had moved, or who had stepped back from the fellowship, or who had gone their own way. That was the phrase people used, and they used it exactly the same way, which was itself a data point. Gone their own way, like a boilerplate. The pattern was consistent. If I asked about someone who had died, people talked. They told me stories, they got emotional, they said the person's name repeatedly. If I asked about someone who had simply left, there was this half-second stall, a small correction of the shoulders, then a redirect. Not aggressive, not obvious. If you weren't specifically watching for it, you'd miss it. I started watching for it. By day 10, I had a list of 11 names of people who had left the fellowship over the past 15 years, pulled from offhand mentions I'd stitched together. When I asked the steward about them directly, he smiled and said, "Some folks find that our way isn't for them, and we wish them every blessing." I asked if he was in touch with any of them. He said, "That's really up to them, isn't it?" His face didn't change while he said it. That was what stayed with me. Not menace, just the smoothness of a man saying a sentence he had said many times. On day 11, my landlord came up to change a smoke detector battery I hadn't asked about. He was polite. He asked how the research was going. He mentioned, offhand, that the room's previous tenant had been a graduate student too, a few years back, doing something on rural sociology. I asked what her name was. He said he couldn't remember. I asked what university. He couldn't remember that either. He'd remembered the discipline just fine. I checked my rental agreement that night. There was no previous tenant clause, nothing to explain how he'd know any of that. I told myself it was a small town and people talk. That's true, and I still believe it. But I also started keeping my notebooks in my car instead of the room. Then a few things happened close together. Cass asked to meet me at the coffee shop, then didn't come. She texted me 2 hours later that she was not feeling great and would need to reschedule. She never did. When I ran into her at the grocery store, she looked at me like she'd never met me, not hostile, just blank, in a rehearsed way. Tom from the food bank stopped answering the door at the fellowship house when I came for our scheduled session. The steward came out instead and said Tom had family in Twin Falls and would be gone through the month. My interview schedule had 8 more names on it, 6 of them canceled within 4 days, each with a different reason, all delivered in the same warm, sorry about this tone. I want to be honest, nothing threatening happened to me in that town. Nobody followed me down a dark road. Nobody left a note on my car. If you asked me to point to a single moment that would hold up as evidence of anything, I couldn't. That's the part I keep coming back to. The absence of a single moment, the way the whole thing was built out of absences. I made a decision on day 13. I called a colleague in Portland and asked her to pull whatever she could on former members who had ended up in Oregon. 2 days later, she sent me a name and a number for a man in a town outside Bend. He'd left the fellowship in 2012. He agreed to meet me on the condition that I didn't record anything, didn't write his name down, and didn't call him again after. I drove out on a Friday. He met me at a diner off the highway. He was maybe 50, thin, wearing a jacket that was too warm for the weather. He kept his hands under the table. He asked me 3 separate times how I'd found him, and each time I answered, he seemed to be checking my face against something in his memory. I'm not going to write down most of what he told me, not because I'm being dramatic about it, because some of the specifics would identify him, and I promised. What I can say is that the fellowship's public activities, the food bank and the youth group, and the Sunday dinners were real. Those parts weren't a front. They were more like a lobby. What he described happening in the back rooms, in the private counseling sessions, in the way money and property moved between families, and what happened to people who tried to leave with their kids, was a slower, more patient kind of harm than what makes the news. It didn't need violence. It ran on paperwork, on relationships, on knowing exactly which pressure to apply to which person and when. He said one thing I did write down later in the car. He said, "The trick is they never do anything you could point to. They do 100 things you can't." I sat in the diner parking lot for a long time after he left. It was almost dark. There was a family loading groceries into a minivan a few spaces over, arguing gently about whether they'd bought enough milk. Ordinary sounds. I drove back to my motel, and I did not go back to Idaho. I called my department the next morning and said I was terminating fieldwork early for personal reasons. I packed the room above the coffee shop remotely, through the landlord, and paid an extra month so he wouldn't ask questions. I never wrote the paper. I never opened the transcripts as research again. What I did do was package everything: the interviews, the maps of who mentioned whom and who stopped being mentioned, the list of 11 names, and a written summary of what the man in Oregon had told me, minus anything that could identify him. I sent one copy to an organization that works with families of people in high control groups. I sent another to the Attorney General's office in the state. I don't know what came of either. I've checked, in the way you can check without checking. Nothing public. Sometimes people ask me why I didn't publish. There's an academic version of the answer, about consent and harm reduction, and the ethics of writing in a way that could be traced back to a source. That version is true. But the honest version is smaller than that. I left before I finished the work, because something in me knew before I did. I noticed I was locking the car when I went into the coffee shop for 30 seconds. I noticed I had started sitting with my back to the wall in restaurants. I noticed I had stopped telling anyone at the fellowship where I was going next. None of them were conclusions. They were just habits I'd developed without deciding to. I drove out of that town on a Sunday morning. The fellowship dinner would be starting in a few hours. Marla had called and left a voicemail asking if I was coming. Her voice sounded exactly as warm as it had the first night. I didn't call back. I got on I-84 West, and I kept the radio off until I was across the state line.